Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is sanctions, international sanctions, and the impact they have, both on Iran and Russia, are in the world's doghouse. Both countries have been slapped with international sanctions. Venezuela is in the same boat, but to a lesser extent. That's probably because Venezuela is simply not occupying space in the world media. Venezuela is not in the world news in the way Iran and Russia are. So in order to survive the burden of these heavy sanctions against them, they are all banding together to work together. And Iran is providing all kinds of goods and services to Venezuela. Satellite tracking of oil tankers is the way in which we monitor where oil is going, and if indeed the sanctions are being broken. And they show images of ships picking up oil in Iran. The ships are tracked and followed all the way to Venezuela. Sometimes the satellite GPS trackers on the tankers are turned off for a time, and sometimes they're not. In the case of Venezuela, most of the time the trackers stay on. Iran and Venezuela are taunting the West. The question begs asking, Venezuela is a member of good standing of OPEC. Why do they need Iranian oil? They're a member of OPEC. They need it because Venezuela cannot pump or refine its own oil. They need it because the sanctions have successfully crippled them. The majority ownership of Citgo Oil and Gas, is Venezuela. We all recognize the Citgo logo splattered around the country, especially, of course, in Boston. The red diamond with the blue letters spelling out CITGO. Officially, Citgo is called Petróleos de Venezuela, SA, or PDVSA. The PDV stands for Petroleum de Venezuela. SA are initials for which mean limited company. And sanctions have prevented Citgo from making money on the sales of gas from Citgo and their stations in the United States. China would be a perfect partner for Venezuela, but Chinese have become shy a little bit, even a little trepidatious, about dealing with Venezuela. If China wanted, they could fill in every type of thing that Venezuela is lacking, in purchasing and in sales, in investments and in technology. But when it comes to Venezuela, and even to Iran and Russia, China has become slow to move, and even scaling back a little bit. China is worried that they might be caught up in what is referred to as secondary sanctions. That means being caught helping a country break out or break their sanctions. When that happens, that country, even China, could be sanctioned for helping. So China is Iran's largest trading partner right now, or at least in 2021. That number is less than half the $32 billion recorded in trade between the two countries in 2018. Only 3 years earlier. Russia, which also needs help fighting sanctions, is getting small bits of help from both China and Iran. Iran and Russia have now bonded, and they are working together in unparalleled ways. We know that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov paid an official visit recently to Iran. We know that because TASS, Russia's official news agency, told us about the visit. But that's all we know from Russia. They didn't tell us anything else. They didn't divulge any further details. However, IRIB News, an official Iranian news outlet, reported that, and I'm quoting, upon his arrival in Tehran, Lavrov met with President Ibrahim Raisi. According to IRIB News, during his visit, which lasted 2 days, Russia's top diplomat and Iranian diplomats discussed the 2015 nuclear deal, the situation in Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, and boosting commercial and energy cooperation. And according to Iran's official news agency, IRNA, Lavrov also met with his Iranian counterpart, Hossein Amir Abdullahian. Last month, Moscow announced that Russia and Iran, which sit on some of this world's largest oil reserves, had discussed swapping supplies of oil for gas. They also discussed setting up a logistics hub. Russia is looking towards Iran, but not in the same way it is looking towards Venezuela. They're certainly not looking in the same way Iran and Venezuela are partnering. Russia is, in essence, looking to Iran for guidance. Iran is experienced when it comes to sanctions. They've been under serious international sanctions since 2018, and Russia views Iran as the model for how to function through long-haul sanctions. By observing their behaviors and by speaking to Iranian leadership, Russia can create a strategy for the long term if international sanctions against them should continue for years to come. That is why they are signing mutual agreements. Slowly, bit by bit, we are learning more and more about the budding friendship, a reliance born out of necessity. The Washington Post reported that, quote, there is some history of distrust between Tehran and Moscow, but common ground is expanding, unquote. Russian state TV acknowledged that were told by Russian Deputy Minister Alexander Novak that the two countries have discussed swapping oil and gas. And Reuters reported that, quote, Iran has lived under sanction for years, and we have discussed the Iranian experience, unquote. TASS has laid out part of the plan, reporting, and this is how they reported it. In late March, Russia's transportation minister said Moscow was studying the case of Iran for insight into maintaining its fleet of foreign aircraft. The following week, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told Russian outlets that Moscow and Tehran could work together to circumvent Western restrictions. In early May, Iran's car parts syndicate said a Russian car maker had reached out. Russia will learn from the Iranians. Iran is masterful at moving their oil across the world by way of tankers. The most significant reason for their success is that the international community is unlikely to intervene on the high seas, especially after Iran turns off their satellite GPS monitors. Once a ship goes dark and stops transmitting a signal, that ship is free to transfer oil to other ships or to change course. Everything becomes speculation from there, and then it pops up somewhere else. Who knows what they did in the interim? These are events we need to follow carefully and monitor. Russia, Iran, Venezuela, China, and yes, even North Korea will all team up in the near future. That does not bode well for the Western world. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from the New York Times. It's not your typical column or opinion piece. This is actually written by Siamak Namazi, an American who has been imprisoned in an Iranian jail since 2015. The column was smuggled out of Iran and sent to his brother. Imagine smuggling out a column, and it was published on June 29th, 2022 in the New York Times. The column begins as a guest essay, and he writes, I'm an American. Why have I been left to rot as a hostage of Iran? That's the title. The Times begins actually with a line of editorial. It writes, the Times now is writing, Mr. Namazi is the longest held Iranian-American prisoner in Iran. Now, here's what Namazi writes. Risking a public appeal while caged in Iran's notorious Evin prison speaks volumes about the depth of my despair. I have suffered quietly as nearly 2,500 of what should have been the best and most productive days of my life were lost behind these bars. But I am compelled to break that silence now because I believe that the Biden administration's approach to rescuing Americans in distress in Iran has failed spectacularly. So far, and unless the president intervenes immediately, we are likely to languish in this abyss for the foreseeable future. I was incarcerated in October 2015 and handed a 10-year sentence after a closed-door trial. The judge ruled that activities such as speaking at university conferences, holding fellowships at the Washington think tanks, and even having a connection to the World Economic Forum were tantamount to attempting to overthrow the regime in collaboration with a hostile foreign government, meaning the United States. A probe by the United Nations called my arrest arbitrary. The United States government and countless human rights organizations have proclaimed my innocence, referred to me as a hostage, and have demanded my immediate release. Namazi now explains that Iran will act only if they are given incentives to act. He writes, but the ugly reality is that Iran will free its captives only if offered sufficient incentives. Critics reject this solution without providing viable alternatives. Nevertheless, it seems any president considering the authorization of a deal for our release factors in the unavoidable political costs of doing so. Indifferent to this political calculus, Tehran seems to be demanding more for our release than the White House can stomach. This catastrophic dynamic has helped me earn an unenviable title as the longest-held Iranian-American hostage in history. My father, Bakr, a retired UNICEF official, isn't far behind, and the conservationist Morad Tabez and the businessman Ahmed Shargi are also still detained. The longest-held U.S. prisoner in Iran now explains that the United States has lost its leverage, and that could be problematic not just for him, but for the United States in general. A little over a year ago, 4 of us had good reason to be optimistic that this scourge would finally end. There was widespread hope that the negotiations to bring Iran and the United States back into the nuclear deal would culminate in success. And the Biden administration has said a nuclear deal would be hard to envision without a hostage deal. That was the right approach, but foregoing an opportunity to free us because the nuclear talks have stalled is not. Now comes a very deep and heartfelt plea for help, and Namazi says it in a way which is heart-wrenching. This is how the column concludes. Sadly, change in the White House brought us no relief. The Trump administration also cut deals, freeing some American detainees while leaving us behind. Mr. Biden, I implore you to put the lives of innocent American detainees above Washington politics and make the tough decisions necessary to free all of us immediately. While political backlash is inevitable, the prolonged suffering and potential deaths of hostages are not. It's hard to imagine my now 85-year-old father surviving the wait for another opportunity. End this nightmare. There's nothing I can add. It is a heartfelt and powerful column. Next up is a column by Gershon Baskin. It was published in the Jerusalem Post and appeared on June 29, 2022. Baskin's column is titled, "The Party I'd Like to Vote For," opinion, and subtitled, "We need a new political movement in Israel that would be the civilian bridge between the Jewish and Palestinian communities, the Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel." Baskin is proposing a new party that embraces coexistence between Jews and Palestinians. He writes, "The land between the river and the sea is the homeland of the Jewish people, and it is also the homeland of the Palestinian people. Israel is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, binational, and multi-tribal society. The Palestinian citizens of Israel make up about 21% of the citizens. They must be seen by Israel as fully equal to the Jewish citizens of the state. The Palestinian citizens of Israel are Palestinian in their identity, and they are also Israeli. They are native to this land. The path towards creating a peaceful state of Israel runs through ending Israeli control and domination over the Palestinian people in the occupied territories, negotiating a just and fair solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, ending Jewish superiority within Israel, and seeking social justice for all citizens of the state. We need a political movement in Israel that would be a civilian bridge between the Jewish and Palestinian communities, the Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. We need a political representation that in its very makeup and constitution symbolizes what the democratic state of Israel should be." Baskin is creating the foundation of a political party. This is almost a framework, and this is what he writes. This new political party would assert that any solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must be based on building of bridges and not walls and fences. The Jewish Palestinian Citizens Political Party would not advocate a particular solution to the conflict, whether one state or 2 states or 3 states or 10 states, or a federation or a confederation of states. Cooperation and partnership must be underlying principles of any solution. The new political party would express its values in the creation of a list of social and political activists from the periphery regions of the country and to the center, including equal numbers of Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, women and men, in a way that would seek to provide as much equal representation as possible. Israel's future will be based on our ability to create active joint citizenship platforms, especially in the political sphere. The so-called experiment of an Arab political party as part of the governing coalition did not fail. It challenged our political system and has pushed us forward in the right direction, the direction where all citizens have a chance for a voice in determining what our shared country is all about. Baskin is a very interesting person. I know him for many years. He's got some interesting ideas. Doesn't mean it's mainstream, but he's pushing the envelope here, and it's going to be very interesting how it pans out in the upcoming elections. Coming up next, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I'm going to show you 8 memes and cartoons today. First up is a headline which shows that even crime is altered by the increased gas prices. It reads, "Criminals prefer to steal cars with better gas mileage due to the increase of the price of gasoline." That's hilarious. Even crooks are changing their behavior because of the price of gas. Next is a meme headline about bees. NYPD beekeepers called to remove 2,000 bees from a Manhattan restaurant. It's interesting because, yes, the New York Police Department and the New York Parks Department both have staffs which only deal with bees. I have personally seen and witnessed these hives and the staffs working to get rid of them. The swarms are huge. Next is an issue that health authorities have been trying to resolve for years. People should not flush their medicines down the toilet. It can impact wildlife. In this case, from the NBC News, we are speaking about meth gators. Police warn flushing drugs could create hyper-aggressive alligators. And then we see a big board with all the police assignments, and the question is, who had the meth gators for July? This next meme is simply funny. It plays on the words purebred. A purebred dog, of course, means 100% of that type of dog. In these pictures, each dog is wearing a slice of bread. Purebred. The idea is silly. The dogs are cute and very funny. We all know about the recent rash of flight cancellations. The scene at airports has gotten completely out of control. In this cartoon, a man is checking in for his flight and is told, okay, your new flight departs from gate 67 at noon. So be at gate 32 no later than 5:20 to see if by chance the flight you're most likely to be rescheduled on when this one cancels is still a go. Very, very funny. Unless, of course, you happen to be that man checking in. Along the same vein and in the same theme, a person is checking in and is told, your plane is delayed. Care to visit our flight school while you wait? There are many reasons for the delays, but one of the reasons is a shortage of pilots. This next meme consists of 2 pictures of a car with a sign. The sign covers nearly the entire rear window of this white Honda. It reads, "Replacement catalytic converter. You already stole mine. Camera is on your face. Cops are on the way to arrest you." This is the second sign. The first one was even more brutal, explaining to the thieves. It reminds me actually of the era when people put signs in their cars that read, "No radio." People are stealing catalytic converters, just like they're starting to siphon gas and steal your gas from your car while it's parked. Finally, this last cartoon is part of a series called Senior Moments. A wife is yelling at her husband, who is sitting at the computer. She shouts, "What do you mean you forgot where you parked? You're shopping online." That's funny. That's very funny. But of course, you still always forget where you park. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Russia is once again lowering the Iron Curtain. They're creating a massive wall between them and the West. Speaking at a press conference, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov explained the separation between Russia and the West this way. It's practically already coming into place. Let them just behave carefully, he said. Since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, Russia has been a pariah state. Moscow has been isolated by the rest of the world. In response, Russia is now proactively responding to the distancing by creating a distance of their own, a new Iron Curtain. U.S. President Joe Biden congratulated Yair Lapid as he assumed his new position as the new Prime Minister of Israel. The blessing came in the form of a tweet in which President Biden spoke of the strong relationship between the countries. The new Israeli Prime Minister responded with a tweet of his own. In his tweet, Lapid wrote, "Thank you, Mr. President. The ties between Israel and the United States are unbreakable. They are based on deep foundations of shared values and a common vision for the future. I look forward to welcoming you to Israel and to strengthening the unique alliance between the United States and Israel." Times have certainly changed. Heads of state tweeting congratulations to each other is not what I would have imagined, especially in this case. Biden and Lapid are not strangers to each other. They have actually developed a bond and a very good relationship. I would have expected that the president would have picked up the phone and called the prime minister directly, not merely send a tweet for all of us to read. Hezbollah sent 3 low-flying drones towards Israel's natural gas rigs in the Mediterranean Sea. Israel shot them down. Hezbollah was sending a series of messages. One, they were saying, Hezbollah argues that these rigs are in Lebanese waters, not Israeli waters, and Hezbollah wants Lebanon to make that claim to the United States. 2, Hezbollah also wanted to let Israel know that their gas rigs are vulnerable. And 3, Hezbollah was delivering a message from Iran, because Iran wanted Israel to know that they have a far-reaching arm and can hit Israeli targets. The drones were all shot down, miles from the rigs. One was shot down by an Israeli Air Force jet, a fighter jet. The second was shot down by an Israeli Navy corvette, also a Navy jet. The third drone was downed by a Barak 1 surface-to-air missile, known as a SAM, surface-to-air missile, surface-air missile. The drones did not explode when hit, which indicated that they were not carrying explosives. Rather than destroy the rigs, their mission was to take pictures that would be used to embarrass Israel and to show the vulnerability of those precious natural gas rigs. Hezbollah's and Iran's plans backfired. Israel's defenses were 100% on target. The Abraham Accords are changing the modus operandi of the way things work in the Middle East. Israel and Morocco normalized relations in late 2020 as a part of the U.S. brokered Abraham Accords. And for the first time ever, Israeli defense officials took part in a military exercise in Morocco. The drill was called African Lion 2022. Israel sent a very modest delegation to Morocco. No troops participated. Instead, there were high-level observers, 3 representatives of the IDF and the Defense Ministry of Israel watched the military drills. The event was coordinated and led jointly by the African Command of the United States Army and the Royal Army in Morocco. This is a very important step for Morocco. It will pave the way for more coordinated activities, way beyond military maneuvers. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is one of the reasons for the rash in theft of catalytic converters? We were talking about that in an earlier humor piece with the pictures. The reason is there are 3 very expensive metals in the catalytic converter. And since 1975, all non-commercial cars needed a catalytic converter. This auto part is attached to the exhaust system of the car. Its function is to take very toxic exhaust fumes and convert them to less toxic fumes. That, by the way, is not non-toxic, just less toxic. Ukraine, and to a lesser extent Russia, supply most of these metals, especially palladium, that is used in the catalytic converter around the world. Because of the war, metals cannot be exported. And because of the war, the price of the metals has been on the rise. They've been on the rise before that also, because not just because of the Russian invasion, but because of the Russian invasion, they've skyrocketed. Look at these prices. The price of an ounce of platinum before the war was $530. That was in 2001. It's $1,100 in 2021. Palladium went from $600 in 2001 to $2,400 in 2021. But it's rhodium that made the most in its rise, averaging $1,600 per ounce in 2001, and now it's $18,000 2021, with a high that year, by the way, of $26,000 per ounce. Contrast that with gold, which went from $300 in 2001 to $1,800 in 2021. The thieves use a rotary saw to cut the catalytic converter. Then the catalytic converter is melted down and the metals are separated and sold. It's that simple for the thief, and extremely costly for the car owner, who now has to find a replacement in order to drive their car. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.